focus of this committee. Michelle?
Yes, thanks, Jim. So Jim's right. I think we've spent a bit of time trying to make sure that we reinvigorate and re-energize the passion and the knowledge base that many of our colleagues, have expressed through the thought exchange. One of the things that I want to say is that I think it's really important for us to, as partners from the federal side, as well as from the institution side, make sure that we understand what each other are talking about. So as we go through the thought exchange, as we go through each one of your comments and areas that you would like to see addressed, what I'll be doing is listening for an opportunity to see how I can make things work from the federal side in partnership with you guys from the institution side. This is nothing new. Jim and I have worked together for many, many years trying to make sure that we address key issues and challenges that we face together, from the institution to the federal partnership, and then making sure that once we address it, we can see the end game, and we'll hear a little bit about some of that success today, so that you guys can be reassured that both Jim and I are very wedded and committed to making sure that not only do we address many of the key principles in the thought exchange, but taking it all the way through to the end, where the administrative burden is reduced on both sides. And so with that, Jim, I turn it back over to you.
Great. Next slide, please. So again, what Michelle and I are hoping is that we leave today in an hour. We understand the priorities that you all think are the priorities, so that Michelle can go back and talk to her team. We can continue to get input from you all, and then we can set up subcommittees, right? We had a strong history of this when Subaccounts were around the corner, and Closeout and the 90 days, and a whole list of things like that that were really effective in partnering with Michelle and the other federal agencies. And that's exactly what we're looking for today. Next slide. And Michelle talked about many of these things, right? This is straight from the FDP website. It's about reducing administrative burden. It's about harmonization. That came across loud and clear in the thought exchange. I think that was probably the #1 topic, along with clarity around, the duplication of the apparent duplication of reporting for the FCTR, the FFR, Subaccounts, and so forth. So Michelle, many of you that know her knows that she's committed to addressing these types of things, the administrative burden and harmonizing. So although Michelle is the co-chair, we'll certainly actively engage the other agencies as we go through this process. Next slide. Did you have anything to add on that, Michelle? That prior slide?
No, except for I think between the partnership of NIH and FDP and others, I think we can do nothing but continue to make changes, whether or not our efforts are acknowledged, in other spheres. That's one thing, but I think that we know from many different conversations and many different sitting down, hashing out with your team, my team, and others across the federal research platform, how things need to be, or how things need to work for both, so that we are all together, and reducing burden is something that you and I are both committed to. So I'm excited to work with you on that.
That's great, Michelle. And one example of that, for those of you that are somewhat new to this, when the closeout guidance came out from NIH and from OMB and was set at 90 days, we spent a lot of time with Michelle to talk about 120 days. And I think out of the gate, Michelle and others were, why would you possibly need that amount of time? Until we talked through the process of closeout, interacting with subawardees, going through appropriate diligence of programmatic confirmation and compliance. And in the UG, I think there's now the 120 days is for all sponsors. Is that right, Michelle? And I would imagine you and Gene and others behind the scenes have been helping with that. So we appreciate that. So for those of you that did the thought exchange, that's about 110 of you or so. This was the question. We wanted input from you on post-award topics where we could focus our energies. And again, the thought exchange is a kind of a crowdsourced networking tool that allows input from you. Next slide. Very briefly, 108 people participated. If you haven't seen it, it's actually still open. If you do want to see kind of how it works, it's been a wonderful tool that we've used with COVID and foreign influence and now this to get input from you all in a really constructive way. And so 108 of you responded and you put in 92 thoughts. So you logged in and you put in ideas that you wanted to, that you thought were important. And then those thoughts were rated 1,870 times. So somebody went in and said, this is a 5-star rating or this is a 1-star rating, and that's going to help us prioritize the discussion today. In the other two slides there on the right-hand side, you can see it's mostly public institutions. About half were public, 38% were private, and so forth. And then we also asked about the role. And as you'd expect, it's mostly administrator, but we did have 7 faculty, which is wonderful, right? And getting the input from the faculty is so critical because in the end game, that's what this is all about. Next slide. So this is a word cloud that's automatically generated from your thoughts. And the word sizes are based on how many times those individual words are in those thoughts. So reporting was mentioned more than anything else, followed by required and COVID and agencies. And when we talk about these thoughts in the next 40 minutes, you're going to see kind of how they came about and how they're prioritized. And the color of each word means they're related. So in this example, grants, awards, and required are in the same relative color. They were mentioned more frequently together than other types of things. So this kind of gives us a quick idea of what we're focusing on. Next slide. And I'm going to pause. I'm going to describe this one, Michelle, and then you can jump in. So again, we had 108 participants putting in 100 or so thoughts, and they were grouped together roughly in these groups, right? So a lot on the FFR, FCTR, sub-account letter of credit, a lot on harmonization, just harmonization in general, right? About reporting, about interactions, about formats, about definitions. Then we had lots of miscellaneous topics. One that we refer to as credits and pennies. And again, as I said in the opening and Michelle said in the opening, we're going to ask for some of you to describe what you meant by your comment and why this is a big deal. So the credits are credits that hit a closed grant, maybe 10 months after the grant has been closed, and we have to go through the process to open the grant, refile the FFR, reverse the letter of credit, go, do that whole thing. So we want to talk that through and see if there's any opportunities. Talked about data storage costs, particularly those related to costs for storage of data after the end of the award. So we'll talk about that more and more with OSTP focus and other guidance, data management plans where our institutions agree to retain that data and make it publicly available for 5 years or 10 years. That's well beyond the end of the grant. That's a significant cost. So are there opportunities that about how we capture those costs, either directly or indirectly? Effort reporting came up a number of times. Discussions related to standardizing the notice of award, the treasury offset, and at our January meeting, there were a handful of people that brought this up. So we'll ask you to be prepared to kind of describe that. A handful of changes related to uniform guidance, some discussion on the standard form 425, and then a myriad of COVID related, getting ready for audits. What are the audits going to be focused on? What about document retention? What about clarity on how we interpreted the OMB and the NIH and the NSF guidance and those types of things? So I'll pause there, Michelle. Before we get into the detailed thoughts, any comments?
No, I think that the summary of thoughts, so I'm always open and welcoming the comments from our colleagues, from our um, research institutions and research nonprofit organizations. I think for NIH, the miscellaneous needs to come under bigger buckets, because I think for us, we want to be able to problem solve larger issues versus smaller issues that are taken care of or resolved by areas that we've already addressed prior. So for me, looking at the FFR, FCTR sub-account letter of credit is something that I think is interesting, and can be looked at from a different lens now that we're out of the pool, so to speak, and into sub accounts. And for those areas and those grants where we are still in the pool, we might need to be thinking of some of these key issues that our colleagues and friends have raised. Harmonization is something that we can't get enough of. And so where we can, in the space of the need for the mission of the federal agency, the need for the legislation that drives the mission of the federal agency, and program regulations, I think we can always look to harmonize. I do have to say that I believe that NSF, Gene Feldman, and others have worked really closely and led the way even in some of the newer initiatives in making sure that we are harmonizing and making sure that we are looking at things in a very key and similar way. And it's been refreshing for us. And then, of course, the COVID audits is something that I'm very wedded to and very interested in, and wanting to protect and make sure we protect both the federal side and the institutions and research nonprofit organizations is my lifeline. So if we can work on that to make sure that we come together and identify areas that may not be clear on either side, and protecting and providing the information that we believe is clear in the FAQs and the guidance that we've offered to both the extramural community as well as our internal NIH colleagues. That's all that we can ask for there. Something, and there has to be a silver lining in COVID, and it's got to be us coming together in an audit. So let's shoot for that.
Thanks, Michelle. You know, I should say that's a conversation that Michelle and I have had a number of times, that us institutions performing well in an audit is a reflection on NIH and NSF and the agencies, and us not doing well in an audit is also a reflection. And that's refreshing that you appropriately assume that accountability and support, whether it be FAQs, whether it be meetings like this, so on behalf of the community, we appreciate that. Next slide, please. So now we begin kind of audience participation. Again, this is where we're getting, these are in essence extracted directly from your thoughts that you all participated, that you all submitted. And these are, as you can see, related to kind of the relationship between FFR, FCTR, sub-account, letter of credit, primarily as it relates to, as Michelle mentioned, shifting from a pooled count to the sub-account, and is there opportunity to replace any duplicative reporting? And I know Michelle, I'm not sure if you're there, Michelle, I know she might have needed to step away. So I'll continue to talk about these. But I would ask if anybody has some specific thoughts. Okay, great. Thanks, Michelle. Do you want to say a couple comments, Michelle, on what NIH and HHS has been working on here before we get into some of the details and input from?
Yeah, I think that's fair, Jim. So, I mean, I think many know that there's been a two-phased approach for reinventing grants management. NIH has provided this level of understanding within our NIH update. So Kristen Todd talked to you guys yesterday about some of the changes, right, that were coming. So I'm not going to say anything that's different from her, except for to say that the first wave and the first phase of the FCTR win, that I have to credit FDP and Koger and Jim and others to, is the phase one of single point of entry. But then the second phase is the one where we have for a long time said that, you know, having and reporting the FCTR up in the payment management system under a sub account no longer makes sense, because when we initially started to report the FCTR, we uploaded that and had our recipients report on that as a result of the pooled accounting, because you drew down, right, on a basis where you had to report back up under different accounts. And with the sub account, you no longer have to do that. And so with us, we're saying, and we're excited about the fact that we no longer will be requiring you all to report back up on the money that you drew down. You will now just certify that you drew down those funds under phase two. And that will just be a certification. And we can now look into the sub accounts and see how much money was drawn down. It's much like a checking account. Very common sense, logical approach. But, you know, drawing down under the pool, you know, didn't have a rhyme or reason. But reporting back up was you reporting back up in a manner that would hold you accountable for the funds that you used for DOE, or the funds that you used for NIH, or the funds that you used for DOD, that, or whomever was the, you know, the recipients of the funding, and reporting back up in the payment management system. So we are looking forward to you guys only certifying and not having to, you know, report back up on a project by project basis, where the funds don't ever match the expenditure report, but only the cash transaction report. And that's something that Jim, myself, and many others had worked and talked about for so many years, and we are seeing that actualized. And so with that streamlined reporting and the efficiencies that we're going to see, and I even think that this is going to make a huge difference in closeout. And the fact that you all are closing out those grants, you know, at your sub account level, and not having to do it on any kind of algorithm. I couldn't make myself think of the word, but it's the algorithm that you guys were, you know, kind of reporting back up on. That drawing down on the algorithm and then reporting back up on that project by project basis. No longer, and we're looking forward to that, and we're really excited that OMB and HHS and others have aligned with this concept and are moving forward in this direction.
So specifically, Michelle, what does that mean? No, and timing. Do you know the details?
So specifically for the single point of entry, we do know that that will be at some point in October, we're hoping. And we're hoping that in 2021, maybe earlier than later, not sure, that we won't have to have you guys do the cash transaction reports. I can't speak on behalf of the department. I do know that we have pushed to had this done sooner rather than later, so that it can line with that single reporting. We're hoping that our colleagues will work in that fashion. And I don't think that it'll be much longer honestly, I don't think that it'll be beyond 2021. But I'm excited. We do have opportunities to ask those kinds of questions of the department, but we've been told that just isn't going to happen. It's not going to be pushed out much further. To give you guys a detailed date, I can't even give you the detailed date on when the single reporting or that single solution for reporting is going to happen. We've been, NIH, we try to put out information, honestly, to give our recipients and our partners enough time to make changes to your systems so that you can adapt and not have to, even be an audit finding because we're making streamlined changes, but the streamlined changes don't necessarily match your systems. That's something that we consistently push for, consistently try to say is important. I know Dr. Lauer and Dr. Black are very wedded to that as well, given, the information that I've shared with them and the success that we've had in making some of these changes. But it's a matter of, getting all of the operating divisions in a place where they can adopt that single solution. And that takes time.
That's great. So I'd ask for those of you that submitted a thought or commented on a thought, if you have any follow-up questions now, if you could raise your hand or put something in the chat. And Michelle, while we're waiting for that, so as you said, this is a lot of coordination with NIH, with the department, right, with HHS, right? This is not something that you can do unilaterally. A lot of coordination.
Correct.
Yeah. So any questions on this based, because this, as I said, this was one of the most significant topics that people are asking about. Do we have any follow-up questions for Michelle on this? A comment from Deborah, fantastic change. Thank you, Michelle. That's good. So anybody else?
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Anybody else before we go to the next slide that has, does this mitigate this concern? Okay, I don't see,
Yes,
we can
CDC
certainly go
will
back.
be following suit.
Say again, Michelle?
CDC, the question is, will CDC be following suit? Yes, they will. They're part of the Department of Health and Human Services, and they will be following suit. Yes, yes, indeed.
Great.
And Jim,
So this,
I do think that some of these questions that have come in from the thought exchange, me giving that overview is helpful, but I'd like to drill down a little bit by going through some of the questions in the thought exchange, because sometimes when people hear, kind of our response and like, what do we need to do together from this committee to help move things along and help make things even help with the way forward for the research institutions and the nonprofit research. I think that's the way we need to proceed. Just how can we help you as we're moving and looking toward that change?
yeah, that's a good question, right? So in other words, is there anything FDP, can we help you as we go through this process? Because I liked your comment about, you announcing this effective October 1, for example, would be wonderful, but we have lots of technical things that have to happen. Business process changes, training in our post-award offices.
That's exactly
and
right.
I'm sorry, I wasn't suggesting it's happening on October 1, but for example.
I think you're right though, Jim. I think that's the thing though. I think when, folks outside of the enterprise and outside of some of these agencies, what we consistently say, and I know I'm the voice of unreason in most cases, right? My folks are not just going to be able to switch that on a dime. This is things that they've been doing, and their systems, their internal systems, their internal processes are driven by this, right? So great that this happens effective October 1, but we need a compliance date.
Right.
Some
Right.
time to allow them to get in.
That's right. So there is a question in the chat box that says, with FFRs being submitted via PMS, will we still be able to see them in ERA Commons? A lot of admins don't have access to PMS to view the reports when needed.
So we're hoping that with this new change and with the new processes, that you are able to see what's going on in PMS. But what will be happening is that we will be making sure that the information that was in PMS is also an API is pushed back into NIH so that you guys can see what that looks like. I have a feeling for the federal cash transaction portion of the FFR, we might be okay, but for the expenditure portion that you're talking about, where you're submitting your expenditure portion, that is a good question. That is a question that I've raised and my staff has raised on several occasions. And I think it just really does go back to the need for us to be able to push whatever you guys have put into the PMS system back into ERA where we do the business. And so I'm going to take this question down because I think it's an important question, and it's a question that I've raised on several occasions, and I'd like that answer. And that's critical. That is very critical because we need to understand unliquidated obligations. We need to understand unobligated balances, program income. These are critical things that where we make decisions on carryover for our complex mechanisms and other things. So yes, this is a very good question that's getting me a little concerned.
Good, good. And I see Paul Gazier has a question. Paul, you want to ask a question?
Sure, Jim, thanks. Michelle, we have two very large sponsors, CDC and USAID. Both of them draw down through PMS. And both of those sponsors have this tendency to issue multiple sub-accounts under one award. So when we report and draw via the FCTR and PMS, we have to report on each sub-account. But when we do the FFR, we have to compile those sub-accounts and report at the award level. I'm concerned that if CDC is going to PMS for reporting, it's not going to turn out the way they think it's going to turn out, because PMS is going to make us report at the sub-account level. And then the same thing with USAID. So I think there's some
So let me ask you a question, Paul. So when you're reporting or when you're drawing down at the project level, right?
At the sub-account level, yes.
So the sub-account level for me translates to project level. So for instance, I'm just going to give you an example. You tell me, Michelle, you have lost your mind. So you have a grant with NHLBI, and it's a specific grant for, COVID. I'm not even going to use COVID. It's a specific grant for NHLBI, and it's an award at that award level.
Correct.
Are you saying to me then that when you report, you're reporting at a different level than that award level, at that doc number level?
On my FFR, no. On the FCTR, yes. When we draw, so CDC will give me an award, and then they'll break it into, say Doc A, and then one will say PEPFAR, and then one will say some country code on it. That's how they're using the sub-accounts. The CDC does that, and USAID does that.
Interesting.
And here's the kicker with it is we don't know what these sub-accounts are going to be until they award the award. So they could give us, they could give us the next tranche of funding, and they change the sub-account, and they make it a completely different sub-account. So now we got to do all this cost transfers. So we set it up in our system. Then we got to do all these cost transfers to put these costs onto the new sub-account.
So
So
that's challenging. That's
yes.
very challenging, and that doesn't look much different from a pool.
So right now, I think we have roughly $20 million where we haven't been able to draw down because we don't have the expenses sitting in the right buckets because they've changed sub-accounts between USAID and CDC.
Okay, so that's a discussion that I'd like to raise. And Jim, if we could get Paul and others to send these kinds of nuances, I think it's important so that at least we can bring it. Yep.
I was going to say, sounds like we have a committee member. It sounds like we have our first subcommittee member, Michelle, Paul and others, right? Truly, right? Because this is what we would love to do is have Michelle have one of her staff members join this subcommittee, be a member of the subcommittee and work through these things.
But not just at the NIH level. I like, because we have commons working groups, and we also not only those, we also have internal leadership groups with our HHS colleagues that I think at my executive grants administration and policy level, I'd like to raise these concerns. Because I don't know that I thought we were all using, right, the same model.
Yep.
And you know, Jim, I would have sworn that you told someone to ask this question. This is a good one, Paul. This is a good one.
Yeah. You're muted, Paul. Oh, you're probably muted again. I think we've heard enough from you, apparently.
Oh, okay. Michelle, I can
I'm joking.
I know. I can send you the examples. I can send them to Jim and you to give you the examples from CDC and USAID.
I think that would be helpful so we can start a committee and look at this.
Great.
Michelle, before we move to the next topic, there is one more, I think, chat, and that is FFR acceptance takes a long time. Is that going to be streamlined? There should be an NIH policy for acceptance within a month or two. Is that any quick thoughts on that, or is that something worthy of additional discussion offline with the subcommittee?
Worthy of additional discussion offline with the subcommittee, because NIH can only run the enterprise. We can't run the HHS functions.
Great. Okay, well, good. We'll add that to the list. That's a good comment. Okay, so let's jump to the next slide. Next slide, please. So most of these are in the pure harmonization theme. Again, I ask for people to raise your hand so that you can articulate what this means or put something in the chat so we can talk about it. Michelle, you commented earlier on specifically about the harmonization that you and Jean and others routinely do, and that's been quite obvious and is great. Any other comments in that space?
No, I think what we should do is take a look at some of the efforts that Jean and I have, what I would like to consider, try to master, in that we really, when, you got to step outside of your agency. You got to step outside of, NIH, Michelle Bowles, NSF, Jean Feldman, and not be in a space where we can't hear one another and see where the other is coming from. And that takes a lot when there is not a policy or a regulation or a statute that governs it. It's easy to hide behind that, but there have been some really hard and critical discussions that we've had with between Jean, myself, my staff, her staff. And I will say that NSF has led the way a lot with some of this other support. And my whole goal was always to, let's see how NSF is doing it. What could we adopt and make it consistent and harmonized for all of our community? And we know that it won't always go the way we want it to go. I know that many of the changes may not be great for our community in terms of, implementation, but we have a way forward together. And once we are able to communicate and articulate what the end game is and what we expect, we will work with you guys to make it right. And that's the thing I think that partnership delivers. So this group it would be helpful for us, to me, if we identify in other spaces where that harmonization needs to take place. And even if we even start with disclosing overcommitment and that kind of thing, if we even want to take that on as burden reduction, looking across agencies, but more importantly, looking across our institutions, and then separately our nonprofit institutions of higher education, our nonprofit institutions or research institutions, because they're not institutions of higher education. But I think it's important for us to identify the two and see what works well for our area institutions versus our institutions of higher education, and then blend those and make it right so that you guys are not in audit findings. And that to me is more important than anything. We know we have to get to a place where disclosure and full disclosure is obtained. So how do we do that in a way that makes sense for all of us? Because we're all in it together. You guys are going to be audited. We're going to be audited. And I'm telling you that is how it's going to be. It's not just one or the other. It's both.
And I don't want to speak for the whole community, Michelle, but sometimes harmony, even at a slightly different standard, is easier for us to execute on internally, because then we have one business process, one training mechanism, one technology solution. It's when, again, I'm speaking for myself, but sometimes we would prefer, if we have to harmonize to a slightly higher standard, but it's the same for everything, sometimes that might be less burdensome and easier for us to execute on. Ideally, we harmonize to the lower standard, but that's just a general comment and observation. So we have, okay, I'm sorry, I was looking at the chat. So in the interest of time, Michelle, let's jump to the next slide. Lillian, if we could jump to the next slide. So this is the beginning of miscellaneous. I think we have 2 miscellaneous slides. We talked a bit about the pennies, right? With the FCTR going away, the things being slightly out of balance to small dollars should be reduced to some degree. But again, I'd ask those listening in, do you have specific comments about credits? Somebody posted that if a grant is closed and then 10 months after the grant, there's a $50 credit, there's a lot of burden in opening that up, reposting it, refiling the FFR, and so forth. Does anybody have any comments on that they'd like to add? Feel free to raise your hand. And actually, why don't we jump to any of these that are on this page, just in the interest of time? Anyone? Okay, Michelle, as we go through this, do you have questions about any of these that you explicitly need clarity from the group? And I just see that Tim Reuter will comment on credits.
That would be
Lillian,
very
can you,
helpful.
great.
But,
Tim, can you comment on that? I'm sorry, go ahead, Michelle.
No, so I'm looking at credits and pennies. I think by default, and that's the part that I mean by maybe we should set up groups that will implement and monitor the implementation of the changes that are coming with the FCTR, both the single portal of entry and the the reporting back up as a, just an assurance and not necessarily reporting the information, reporting the dollars. I think it would be helpful for us to do that, because I think what we need to do as a community, as well as a committee, is look at some of the areas that we've had on the table for a long time. So credits and pennies, right? The pennies likely will go away. What do we do about the credits, which we'll hear from our colleague Tim about, and what that means for many institutions? And then is it really a factor for many institutions, or is it just the way that, certain agencies require the letters of credit? And I'm really interested in hearing about that, because I told you that I wasn't clear about that, Jim, initially. But then understanding what the needs are here and seeing whether or not the implementation of the FCTR phases 1 and 2 will address these, and monitoring them and working to make sure that any implementation on our side matches the implementation on the institution side. Because this is not necessarily NIH feeding the institution's information. This is NIH working with the institutions to make sure that if there's an audit finding, did we cause it? Or if you're not doing something, did you cause us to be in a situation? It's that back and forth.
Sure. Tim, did you have more to add?
Yeah, a couple of things. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay. A couple of things. One is small credits that come back through, like you said. I mean, one of them is compressed gas. Those guys submit revised invoices to us constantly. And so we get $5 and $10 and $15 credits that go back and forth that mean nothing. And they come in, could be a month or two later, it could be a year or two later when the gas company finally figures out their billing or whatever and does it. And as Jim said, I mean, the time it takes to redo an FFR and to send it to you guys and all, I'm more than happy to give you your money back, but I'd be much more appreciative if I could just roll it all up and at the end of the year, report to you on an award by award basis, and here it is. Now, for me in California, I have a unique thing going on with the state of California in that we pay sales tax on like everything. And the state of California, like years ago, came in and said, hey, if you're buying a piece of research equipment, we will reduce the sales tax that you have to pay on that. But unfortunately, in the state of California, when I pay the sales tax, I pay it to the vendor I buy the piece of equipment from. So in order to get the refund back, I had to go back through the vendor I bought the equipment from. They had to go to the state. The state had to review all these things, send it back to the vendor, and the vendor back to me. So I get some of these refunds back, 2 years, 3 years after the purchase was made. It's already dropped off the NIH system, and it's just, again, it's a tremendous amount of work that, again, some of these we have just recently gone and sent a check back to the Treasury or to NIH. Now I send it directly to NIH for that. And so this is one that just is a killer. Way back in the day before NSF switched over to, their AMS system to draw, they said anything up to $300 after the award ends, whether you're going to report more expenses or less expenses, just keep and let's move on and let's not worry about it. If you don't want to go that high, that's fine. But I'd certainly like to get way above 5 or 25. I'd at least like to get to 100 or love to get back to $300, just because as Jim clearly stated, the amount of work on my end, the amount of work on NSF's end, or NIH's end to amend the thing and redo all that stuff is just mind-boggling for the amount of money we're talking about.
Yeah, I'm mute, Michelle.
Sorry, that's something that we had been working on for a while, just trying to figure out what that dollar amount is, or what would be the threshold. We put out a threshold that we were working with our chief financial officer on, and we just need to figure out from a HHS standpoint, working with our colleagues at HHS to see what's really feasible. The other thing that, we talked about, and we've been talking about it for a long time, is, getting away from the dollars and cents and only allowing dollars. But we don't know how that looks either. So I hear you. This is something I think that we should honestly pursue. This might not go away, even with the reporting back up, just certifying that you drew down on a certain amount. If we don't identify the fact that it doesn't need to be in dollars and cents, and it starts getting into the pennies, there's still going to be a considerable amount of work to reconcile. And that bothers me, that troubles me greatly. So, Jim, I'd like to think that we should probably ask for leadership in this particular area.
Great. Okay, that's great. And as Tim mentioned, we're happy to send a check back. It's not about the money. It's about the
That's
burden,
not the key,
right?
though, but we need to look at
yeah.
it from a very
Okay,
strategic
great.
standpoint.
Great. We'll make sure we look at this.
Yeah,
And I want to manage time. That's great. Lillian, can you unmute Nate Martinez-Wayman? And Nate, if you can just take a minute on the data storage costs, and then we'll jump to the other ones. Because Michelle, as you know, we do have a polling question. So Nate, if you can hit data storage costs quickly.
Sure, I'll keep it very brief, knowing that it'll lead to some discussion later. And this is probably for the A in the name of our committee, the audit part of it, where we'll have PIs who, as part of the project, very transparently need to do data storage long after the project period has ended. And so right now, incurring costs along those lines would clearly not be okay by the uniform guidance audit components because there's benefit accruing after the end of the project period. But as it's more in the Fed's interest to continue public data access and data storage, then that's just going to be something that we'll need to look at from the audit guidelines perspective of how do we define the portion of these costs that are after the project, and how do we get the auditors on board with keeping them allowable. That's all.
Yeah, and Nate, to follow up on that. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, I think that's going to be another really good subcommittee under this group. I think it's viable because, we don't have contingency costs, but we, do have expectations that, the storage fee, the storage will, like you said, Nate, happen long after the project period ends. So, perhaps the guidance and the policies that come out from NIH regarding the data storage requirements and the costing issues is something that Dr. Lauer and Dr. Black have engaged Opera and myself in. So I think having us to talk about this would be an extremely helpful discussion, and looking at it from a couple of different vantage points. I have my compliance hat on and looking at it from one angle, and I'm sure you guys as well. So understanding what those costs are, whether they're fees during the project period, and that's how it's charged. And then there's an expectation that beyond the project period, those storage requirements are in place, and locking them into the institution, complying with the NIH requirement is an aspect of it that we need to consider, and that we will consider. And I think we have to talk about what that looks like as an implementation and compliance standpoint as it relates to the terms and conditions of the grant, and what kinds of details and requirements will be outlined in the terms and conditions of the award, and how that looks, and how the institutions are able to implement that in a logical way.
Thanks,
That's great.
Michelle.
That's
I don't
helpful.
know
So
that
we'll-
we're ever gonna, so we've had some discussions about cloud computing costs. We've had a lot of discussions, specifically in the area of strides, and someone actually put that in there. I didn't even see that. Yeah. But the clear guidance and position on associated cloud computing costs and F&A would be helpful. I think that's a government-wide challenge that NIH is happy to be at the table at. That's an OMB discussion that we need to have as agencies. I know that there have been discussions from other agencies, and it's been clear on what the positions have been. We do intend to align ourselves with what the needs are in the mission and the costs and how they make sense. And then if we need to go through HHS to OMB to look at some deviations or look at some specific costs for data storage and cloud computing, or specifically cloud computing. I think the agency is willing to do that, but we're also looking at it from a very, how does this look for compliance costs? Is this something that you would want to pay full F&A for? Not sure that that's really, from a costing perspective, the way to go. So those discussions are being had, and I don't want to get ahead of my leadership within NIH, but I do think that I do have some views on whether this really is, full F&A worthy versus some compliance costs that we would offer at the de minimis level, or what that looks like. So I will stop there with that. I do think, though, it is important for us to engage and talk about data sharing and having a committee that looks at admin burden and looks at costing issues related to that, because I think that's going to be helpful across the board, and specifically for NIH as we look to move forward with our data sharing policy.
That's great. That's great. Thanks, Nate. Thanks, Michelle. So Lillian, do we have a hard stop in 5 minutes, or can we go over a minute or two?
We can go over 1 or 2 minutes, but we do have another session beginning that we have to get ready
Okay,
for.
great. So Michelle, which I know treasury offset is one that you and I have talked a bit about. Tim, you're in my view again. You and I, you brought this up at the January meeting. Can you hit this quickly? Lillian, can you unmute Tim Reuter? Thank you.
Got it. Okay, the treasury offset thing, mostly this comes to us from the VA Palo Alto, our Palo Alto VA Center. What generally happens is we purchase services from one of their physicians. They bill us. If we either do not get the bill or fail to pay the bill in a school of medicine department, the VA will send 2 reminders. And to each reminder, they will add an administrative fee, and they will add an interest fee. So then I lose the idea. I don't know how much the original invoice was for. They put them together. The VA tells me that once a month or whatever within 90 days, then they will, the treasury offset will just scoop up those invoices, send them to the treasury, and the treasury will offset my payments to me for other awards. I go back to the VA, and the treasury offset will send me a letter that says, hey, we took your money from the VA. They can't tell me what award it's for. I go to the VA, and the VA can't tell me what award, which multiple awards added up to this dollar amount or whatever. And I'm stuck. I can't go to a school of medicine department to get paid because I can't give them a copy of the invoice. The VA can't give me a copy of the invoice. And I spend months and months and months trying to find out what's going on.
You have 30 seconds, Michelle. Can you fix that in the remaining 30 seconds?
No, I can't fix that within the remaining 30 seconds, but I do think we should talk about this. And the reason why I think we should talk about this is because I've been a little concerned about what we've been doing in the space of adding offsets to our notice of award. And I'm very fearful that folks will get this treasury offset and the offset that's undefined right now on the notice of award mixed up. And
Those are two,
I'd
yeah.
like to hear, yeah, and Tim, my worry for this, honestly, is from an audit perspective. If we don't have a definition of what we mean by offset, and someone looks, the definition of treasury offset is in the regulation. And someone will think that that is exactly what NIH and HHS and all of us are talking about, and that's not the case. So I'm really, we need to discuss this.
I'd be happy to be
Okay.
involved with whatever you want to do there.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thanks. And I see in the notes that Lynette mentioned that there is some discussion about the VA and the Treasury being more active with FTP. So that might be a great opportunity for us to partner with them as well.
But I think
There's lots of comments.
if we're getting at the same place. So we want to make sure that we, you know, at least we need to nail the issue down so that we don't open up
Yep.
other cans of worms.
Got it.
Not already
Great.
there.
That's a great point. That's a great point. So I'm gonna, since we're almost out of time, we are out of time, Michelle, can we jump to the poll, Lillian, and we'll come back. I think we're gonna need more discussion on all of these, Michelle, and you and I can talk about the best way to do that. So here's the poll. We talked about a lot of issues. Michelle, I've taken notes that we are going to create some further conversation, whether that's a subcommittee or a survey or a group, but around the implementation of the FCTR change, the phase 1 and phase 2, the single point of entry and the FCTR change. Another group of discussion on harmonization, another one around credits, another around data storage costs, and then some clarity on this treasury offset. And I would imagine there's others out there will do. But if you had to pick one, what would that one be? And I should say in the COVID audit, we skipped right over that. Michelle, that was more about what's going on from a COVID audit perspective. How can we be ready for it? How can we make sure that we can manage that? But if people could pick one right now, that would be great. I know that's hard to do. Michelle, do you, in the interest of time, do you have any comments on these? Because after this, we'll do a brief closing and then turn it over to Lillian.
The top 3 that we need to really be focusing on. One is an overarching one, which is harmonization. And I think that's going to rule everything we do after that. I see the COVID audit issues. And reducing financial burden. And the reducing financial burden and the FFR, FCTR, and LOC are going to be very critical areas where we harmonize, even if it's just within HHS and working through that. Like Tim had mentioned, you know, just the CDC factor and USAID. Now we can't drive USAID because USAID is not under the Department of Health and Human Services, but we are making, and so for the FFR, FCTR certification, that's specific to HHS OpDivs. And so I like the thought of us reducing that financial burden, looking at the LOC, looking at the treasury offset, because I would put this under reducing financial burden as well. And I think the COVID issues and the prep and kind of aligning yourselves and looking at the agency policies and that kind of thing is a very prudent way forward. And I think harmonization is just the umbrella of it all.
That's great. That's really helpful. So I'll thanks to everybody. Michelle, always your partnership is great. If we can connect, Michelle, with you and your staff over the next couple of days.
That came in from a good friend of ours that we would be remiss if we didn't address it, just because he has been a partner with us in so many other areas. With the Joe Genhardt here talks about the updated UG does not recognize the procurement via sole source based upon scientific requirements, and would NIH consider this issue during its implementation? And so in answering that question, I think that we really want to make sure that I understand that issue, because the way it reads, it's not specific to scientific requirements. And if there's something that we need to understand, that we need to talk to HHS about, that impacts more than one institution, and this is a bigger issue, or even better, if this wasn't an issue when we kind of pushed O&B on making the changes under the procurement section, we need to identify that as well. NIH will not be able to go out on its own to implement portions that are not, that we don't have a sound justification for, that impacts most of our institutions, if not all, or at least the larger institutions, if you will. So I'd be happy for Joe and others to give us some additional information about that. And hi, Deborah.